Hi, I'm Ryan, and I'm a consultant for ThoughtWorks. I specialize in helping ThoughtWorks clients get value out of their data. And using machine learning is an important part of getting value out of data. And some of the projects that I work on are about making best use of machine learning.
It's loud. I'm Meissane. I'm an ML engineer at ThoughtWorks. My role consists of helping our clients build mostly MLOps platforms, but also data science projects, from proof of concept to production. I've also got experience with more building a good data organization and also getting value out of data with data mesh.
So lots of discussions of machine learning governance never really get into practical aspects. And failing to get into the practicalities can be quite confusing when you're a developer and you really want to know how to actually make these things work. So we're going to try and break through this confusion and tell you what ML governance is for and how you can really do something about it. So let's get started. First up, why is this topic so confusing? Why do so many people feel like they don't even know what ML governance even is? Well, it's understandable that we get confused about ML governance. There's a lot of different aspects, and it's easy to get lost in all the different conversations that are going on. There's hot topics like responsible AI, and that's getting a lot of attention. There's also these like nitty-gritty down in the details topics like MLOps and reproducibility. And each of these is a part of the wider whole that is ML governance. We could roughly cluster these different aspects of ML governance under ethics and principles, tech practices and MLOps, and management and frameworks. This helps us get a better picture of what ML governance is, but it only takes us so far.
We also need to think about the relative weight or perceived importance of the topic under ML governance. And when people think about ML governance, they tend to mostly think about ethics. It's a big part of it, but documentation, sign-off, it tends to fall under bureaucracy, and people rather not really get involved with it. So in this talk, we kind of want to shift the thinking to think about documentation and peer review as part of best practice, and that should really be reinforced by good governance processes. And sign-off shouldn't be really about having to beg someone to tick a box next to your model. It should be about positioning risks and trade-off decisions with the right people. The fact is that it's surprisingly easy to make a big mess with ML projects, and you can end up doing something that leads to like a reputational damage disaster for your organization, or really just have regulatory problems, or just annoy your client by doing something that wasn't behaving with your intent. And governance should ensure that these kinds of risks are identified early and owned by the right individuals. Otherwise, risk management doesn't happen, and you sleepwalk into a mess. And some big leading companies have walked into quite big messes, and we'll talk about one specific case later.
So now that we know what ML governance is about, how do we make it actually happen? This slide is probably already looking very simple and surprisingly simple, and I should say it's not the whole answer to ML governance. This is a starting point that we'll use in this presentation. You can think of this as a flexible template for a process that can be adapted for different organizations and teams. In ML governance, we want to place the right kind of questions and decisions to sit with the most appropriate roles. Too often, what we're seeing is that data scientists are assumed to have already assessed risks and dealt with them, so that product management then and other business managers don't have to think about those risks. This flow is about making the roles explicit so that the risk management does sit with product management and business executives. The flow hinges around certain key documents that you can see here named as the model card, the model validation report, and the model owner approval. But the flow is not just about producing documentation or even producing good documentation. It's also about facilitating informed decision-making and positioning decisions with the most appropriate roles. The model developer produces a model card which documents the purpose of a model, its design, what data it uses, what risks are known around the model, and advice on how the model should and should not be used. This is then checked by the model validator. The model validator checks the model is reproducible, that the code and documentation are clear, and that when this process starts, there might be some back and forth here. We can think of it like a pull request review process. There might be a separate model validation report that's a distinct document from the model card, or it might be a section that gets added to the model card, or it might even be that this is a dialogue that happens in a pull request with structured comments on the pull request. The model validator might be a data scientist, and that might be a single role, and that's all the validation that is needed, or there may be more than one model validator. There may be some validation that's added from a ML engineer or a support engineer to ensure that the background is there to be able to monitor the model when it goes live. And the next step is the model owner. The model owner is looking for clarity about how the model works and how it should be used and its limitations, but the model owner is looking for a different kind of clarity from the model validator. The model owner probably won't be technical, so they need a different level of explanation. Now, this might result into more back and forth on the documentation. The key thing is that the model owner needs to know about any risks and trade-offs that are associated with the model, because it's that model owner that's going to be responsible at the business level for the model when it goes live in a business product or business process.
Within this process, there might also be an escalation route to an oversight board. And not every organization will have an oversight board, but if you do, then they would become involved in cases that are considered like high risk, and that would need to trigger like a deeper review with more parties involved and more of the leadership part of the organization. So factors that could trigger this escalation are, for instance, the use of sensitive data or regulated or copyrighted data. Otherwise, model making decisions that could have a negative impact on an individual, like a social scoring system. Issues arising from ISRM security review, or any other serious concerns about the quality of the model that could have basically poor cost implication on the company, having losses on the product. So there's a lot to understand here. So we'll try to make it more concrete, and we'll go into the detail of what is a model card and what a model validator or model owner should be looking for here. So in terms of how do we document ML models, there's been a lot of discussion on how to best do it, and there's different shapes, so we're not really here to recommend a specific one, but we've just listed the most notable approaches, and we'll dive deeper into Google model cards. But if you're interested, you can ask us for the link of the presentation later. So I'll just open the model card. So this is a face detection model card. So the model is basically detecting faces with bounding boxes. And here what they say is the input of the input that the model takes, the outputs, what it does, the architecture of the model, its performance. But the key takeaway here is it's also listing all of the limitations of the model and making those obvious to anyone who's going to probably use it but doesn't really know how to best apply it. So it's saying that it depends on the face size, the facial orientation of the image, the lighting, occlusion, blur, motion. So it might seem obvious, but sometimes people might omit that these could be limitation, and then you're taking an input and getting poor results. It's also saying about the trade-offs. So if you put an image that's high resolution, it's going to have more latency and be slower, and more details around kind of the performance metric and letting people kind of test the model here. A model card can also include more like fairness, biases. So if there are any, for instance, this one doesn't include it, so we assume the model is quite fair. But if, for instance, there was a problem around the skin tone of the people that are in the picture, it's the place that this type of risk should be highlighted so that the model owner can make the relevant decisions on whether to sign off the model or not. So there is a variety of purposes for these model cards, and what really should be highlighted under them is under what condition does the model perform best, whether it has blind spots, It would also give an overview of the internals and the architecture of the model. But it's really an open documentation format, so it needs to be shaped by the team who's using it, and there should be kind of an agreement within the organization on what are the governance standards that should be around that. And model cards are more specific around the models, not necessarily the data, but data should also have a similar level of scrutiny. So that's model card. That's the central piece in the process that we talked about before. You could simply extend the model card concept as the three documented. Oh, you're not seeing the slides, yeah. Yeah, you could simply extend the model card in this process to be used here. And maybe the model validator just provides feedback that updates the model card, and the model owner would be the one approving whether what's recorded on the model card is correct.
Okay, so to finish up, we'll illustrate why this is so important by looking at a famous case of getting bitten by risks in using machine learning. One that illustrates the point well is when Apple Card launched in 2019, and its credit assessments were accused of gender bias. So this is an interesting case in part because this is Apple, and they're obviously known to be a technology leader, and you would expect them to be able to use ML highly effectively and to manage these kinds of risks. But the fact is this is a very new kind of thing to be doing in the industry, and everyone's making mistakes. Lots of high-profile people were critical of Apple Card when it launched, including Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak. In fact, and they were critical that they thought that the credit assessment process was had baked-in gender bias because their spouses were getting lower credit limits. Now, there was then an investigation by the New York State Department for Financial Services, and the investigation actually found no gender bias. The problem was actually that people didn't understand the logic of the service that was being provided. There were complaints that the female spouses were getting these lower credit limits, and this was questioned on the basis that the spouses had shared assets and shared income. Now, this idea of shared income can sound confusing from here in the UK, but in the US, if you file a joint tax return, then that's considered to be shared income for credit assessment purposes. But there's an aspect to the logic that was being overlooked, which is that credit histories are still distinct. So even if you've got shared assets and income, you still have a distinct credit history, and that's part of the logic of the assessment algorithm. So it was these different credit histories that were the reason why the spouses were getting different credit limits. And whilst that would seem to exonerate Apple Card, but the New York State Department for Financial Services was still critical of what had happened because Goldman Sachs, who was running the service on behalf of Apple Card, they were unable to provide the kind of clarity on this at the time when it happened. They weren't able to respond to all these customer complaints, and they weren't able to explain why the credit scores were coming out the way that they did. It was only after through the investigation that it became clear what was happening. So this is a good example of how these kind of risks can get overlooked and can cause a lot of reputational damage. You can imagine this risk might have been overlooked or just not prioritized due to the rush that was in place to get Apple Card's service live. And the key point for this talk is that if our suggested approach had been followed, then this risk that the algorithm wasn't transparent and wasn't making its logic visible, it should have been surfaced early, and an Apple Card product manager would have been in a position then to make an informed decision about whether to go live, given that that risk was there, and whether there was any mitigation strategies that they wanted to put in place. So, in summary, ML governance is multifaceted, but the core of it, the most important thing to deal with, is surfacing risks. And we've presented a simple, or overly simple maybe, but a template process that's based around model cards and that gives you a way to make sure that the right kinds of decisions are placed with the appropriate roles.
The model owner role also is key to risk management. A model developer is not always in the best position to sign off a risk, and that should be clearly defined. And this process needs to really be shaped by the team on the ground and the use case. It's not a fixed process. Thank you.